Hi, thank you so much. As Sonia said, I'll be presenting on the narrative strategies used by the welfare associations during the COVID-19 pandemic to represent weak interests, so-called weak interests. So the interest of those in poverty, interests also of refugees, and their families. This is a work in progress that I'm currently working on for DemSoz, and it should be a paper that will be published, hopefully. So the background of my presentation today, COVID-19 as a potential social and poverty policy game changer, as Florian Bank mentioned in his presentation. There was talks during the pandemic that this could potentially change social policy because the federal government was forced to experiment with certain policies. I'll talk about more of that shortly. And during this process, the welfare associations were quite active to influence this policy process. I'll then talk very briefly about my theoretical and methodological considerations for my analysis of the welfare association's narrative strategies, and then mostly focus on the three strategies that they used during the pandemic. First, looking at the neglect of the federal government towards people living in poverty. Second, emphasizing social rights as the sort of foundation of the benefits, not charity. Social rights are what is behind the benefits, not charity. And then finally, the fundamental distrust that exists between welfare beneficiaries and the federal government itself. And also the administration, the labor administration, and the state governments. So, COVID-19 as a driver of social policy reforms. So, during the pandemic, because of the specific challenges presented by the pandemic, and the fact that the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic were particularly bad for vulnerable groups, some have argued in social policy research that it was a sort of spotlight on the structural issues affecting people living in poverty, a Scheinwerfer in German, on the issue of poverty. And because of the structural issues that were shown during this pandemic, initially, many also saw it as a potential window of opportunity to shift policy, particularly concerning the minimum income, basic social assistance, formerly known as Hartz IV, which, as Florian Bank mentioned in his keynote, has played a very contentious role in social policy discussions in Germany in the past 20 years. And it's a discussion that revolves around the idea that the basic social assistance model has entrenched poverty and not necessarily solved it in any way, but made it even potentially worse. Some aspects were ruled unconstitutional, particularly the sanctions of the system, and then the system was reformed in December of 22 against the background of this criticism, the contention, the constitutional court decisions against the system. So what happened specifically during the pandemic? There were, particularly concerning beneficiaries of the basic social assistance model, there were 2 one-time payments for assistant recipients. For children living in families receiving this benefit, there were free school lunches. There was school computers, so transfers for children living in families receiving the benefit, school computers and tablets so they can continue taking part in school. And most importantly, and perhaps most controversially, there was increasing unconditional access to the system. This was directed specifically towards people like freelancers, people like artists, who were initially affected by the crisis and had no other form of income, and so there was no longer a wealth check, for instance, on people who would receive this benefit, because up until then, there was quite a strict wealth check on those who could receive the benefit. And then there was the moratorium on non-compliance sanctions within the system, so people who don't follow the rules, as the employment centers say, are sanctioned, their benefits are reduced. It's a small minority who's sanctioned, but nonetheless a significant group, and so those were stopped. And what did the welfare associations do during this time? Well, they played a crucial role in influencing public discourse on issues affecting those in poverty through moral emotional characterizations, while emphasizing constitutionally guaranteed social rights, and I argue that they do this through narrative strategies. So why should welfare associations interest us in this regard? So inside of the corporatist German system, as we heard this morning, the welfare associations play an important and significant role as a collective third sector actor. They provide and administer social services via social work. They're multi-level lobbyists and consultants in reform processes. So they're actively involved in reforms at all three levels of German government: local, state, federal. An interesting aspect of the welfare associations is that they're kind of, in some regards, a hybrid actor. So on the one hand, because they consider themselves to be a voice of social work and they employ social workers, they represent their interests both economically and politically, while also arguing that they are an instance of representation of weak interests, so-called weak interests, as I said, poor, homeless, refugees, disabled individuals. And often these interests align, but sometimes they don't. And so welfare associations must play both of these roles inside of the corporatist German system that sees civil society as playing a major role inside of social policy making. Against this background, because welfare associations are responsible, for instance, for a third of all social services in Germany, and because they're embedded inside of the institutions of the German welfare system, they have significant leverage. And because of this leverage, I argue that they play a powerful argumentative role inside of the system by first countering dominant meritocratic storytelling that basically says poverty is an individual issue. Those who are in poverty are responsible for the state they find themselves in. This kind of storytelling is quite dominant inside of the welfare system. They seek to provide a voice to the vulnerable. They consider themselves story conveyors within crises in general within the welfare state. As I mentioned, leverage within the welfare state due to their position, and also importantly, they regularly collaborate with other civil society actors. So they collaborate with trade unions, they collaborate with environmental organizations, among other groups. So there are 6 welfare associations in Germany. I won't go into the details of the welfare associations, but it's important to understand that particularly concerning issues of poverty, 4 of the welfare associations are quite active inside of the poverty discourse. One being Caritas, the Catholic welfare association, Diakonie, more of the Protestant organization, Paritätischer, more of a secular democratic welfare association, and AWO, which is supposed to represent the interests of workers inside of Germany. And all 4 of them are quite active in this discourse. And there's also a federal organization with this long acronym that is supposed to bring the voices of all of the welfare associations together when it comes to commenting on reforms on the federal level and finding a common line during crises, which was during the pandemic an important organization. So the organizations had a similar communication strategy in the crisis. Interestingly, despite the welfare associations playing this major role inside of the welfare system, there's not much established literature on the role played by welfare associations in influencing policy. There are some works that are important, but there's no established literature looking at the central role of the welfare associations. And against the background of Demsotz, this is quite puzzling, considering welfare states across the West, and Germany as well, are experiencing rising political inequality, so marginalized groups, the poor, vote less comparatively. So if we consider the circumstances of rising social and political inequality, then it makes sense to look at what the organizations that argue to represent these interests are doing concretely politically. And crises are a good gateway to look at these practices, because it's particularly during crises, as Sonia mentioned, that problems are exposed, problems come to the surface, issues are amplified, and solutions are called upon. So it's particularly during these circumstances where organizations like welfare associations need to engage in the policy process. So this is why I also look at the COVID pandemic to analyze these practices. So until now, most of the focus has been on job creation measures during the crisis, family policy measures as well, as Sonia mentioned, but there's still, to a certain extent, missing literature on how marginalized groups, such as the long-term unemployed, welfare recipients, and those affected by poverty are portrayed, and how those who represent their interests, or them themselves, protect their own interests in public discourse. So I've posed the following questions to address this research gap. What role did welfare associations play during COVID, and which narrative strategies did they implement? And also importantly, looking at the Bürgergeld reform and the fact that compared to the ambitious goals that were set initially, which the welfare associations supported to a large extent, what explains why welfare associations aren't able to realize their policy goals? Which connection can one see between their narrative strategies, and why they're not able to fully realize their policy goals in terms of the basic social assistance system? So very briefly, theoretical and methodological considerations. Sonia went into this into quite a bit of detail. I come from more of a interpretist perspective, and I try to bridge the gap between interpretive perspectives and the narrative policy framework which Sonia presented. And inside of narrative policy framework research, there's been an increasing amount of effort on trying to bridge this gap. So I try to contribute to this growing literature, bridging the gap between NPF and interpretive perspectives. And I do this by combining argumentative discourse analysis, so looking at a controversial policy discussion like poverty, and bridging that with narrative, so which stories exist within a controversial policy discussion. And to gain access to these narrative strategies, I look particularly at 186 newspaper articles from 2020 to 2022, from the Süddeutschen newspaper, so more of a left-liberal newspaper, and FAZ, more of a conservative liberal newspaper. I also analyzed 92 press releases by the Welfare Association, so the 4 I mentioned, and then on top, the federal organization, the umbrella organization that represents all of them. And I also conducted 9 semi-structured interviews with 4 welfare associations with leaders in these organizations to gain access. Important for me, simultaneously, to answer the second question I posed is understanding the role of power and narrative, which has also been a concern of the narrative policy framework in the past few years. And a lot of the scholars in this field have looked at Stephen Luke's conception of power by looking particularly at 3 dimensions of power, which he eloquently lays out for analysis. The first being power over, which is the overt exercise of authority. So I say one thing should happen, A should lead to B, and then B happens. That's the clearest form of power one can see. The second form of power is power 2, the agenda setting. So it's the capacity for political actors or organizations to influence what is or what is not put on the political agenda. And then the third aspect is power with, and this is more of a, one could say, vague, not as clear form of power, argumentative power, the ability to influence discussion, influence public discourse, influence the perceptions of the public at large. So in the third dimension is obviously where the welfare associations have the most potential to influence policy, but also I want to look at their activity at the 2 other levels. Importantly, Frank Nuhlmeier, social policy expert, professor in Bremen, argued in a paper a long time ago, but I think it's still quite relevant to the research I'm trying to do. He argues that organizations representing weak interests have a specific power in terms of arguments and influencing policy discussions through moralistic arguments, particularly by emphasizing the deservingness of the groups they are trying to represent. So, the narrative of the welfare associations during the pandemic, entitled The Narrative of the Forgotten. So the core focus of the narrative is to address the forgotten, both in public discourse and in policy making and social policy making. So the poor, welfare recipients, homeless, by using diverse forms of storytelling to reach different audiences which can influence a policy outcome. For instance, influencing media through press releases, through interviews, influencing expert-based discussions through the production of their own reports on poverty, for instance, and also the political level, of course, through lobbying, and through discussions within the lawmaking process. And as I mentioned, COVID-19 was an opportune situation to influence these discussions for the welfare associations because of the injustices which came to light during the pandemic, forcing policymakers to experiment with certain policies. And indeed, the welfare associations consistently intervened in discussions during this time. As one interview partner stated, their key goal in their public work in media and politics is to transport the stories of those affected by poverty, to make the invisible visible. And this is done using 3 narrative strategies which I've identified. First, exposing government and societal neglect. Second, highlighting benefits as legally and constitutionally guaranteed social rights. And third, overcoming fundamental distrust between welfare recipients and the government. So let's look at the first strategy first, the neglect strategy. So at the beginning of the pandemic, welfare associations typically describe the pandemic situation as being a public policy tragedy. And this is because, in their eyes, the federal government, state government, local level, oftentimes overlooked the specific vulnerabilities of the poor and vulnerable, even portraying them negatively. So initially in the pandemic, homeless individuals were portrayed as a potential threat because infection rates were rising. So either they were being ignored or they were being portrayed negatively initially. And also the economy, saving the economy and the economic effects of the pandemic was a focus of the federal government, basically neglecting the needs of those most impacted by the crisis. And so the welfare associations used various campaigns to draw attention to these interests. For instance, the campaign of Diakonie, which has existed since 2018, but was reactivated during the pandemic, called Unerhört, which can be translated as unheard and outrageous. Simultaneously, was used to bring attention to the specific experiences of people living in poverty. There were strong lobbying efforts to ensure that there was enough funding for social infrastructure and social work during this time with the passage of the Social Service Deployment Act. And there was also a strong alliance between the various organizations to ensure that the needs of these groups were met through laptops, school lunches, and specific transfers. Some quotes from my analysis. We can see initially the argument from Caritas in this instance, that initially there was a huge stimulus package passed at the most acute phase of the pandemic, a historic stimulus package for the economy, and not a single cent was additionally spent for the poor during this time, highlighting the disinterest of the government in this historic moment. And because of this, there were many deliberate commonalities in the public strategies of the welfare associations to really drive the point home that these interests are not being paid attention to. And one interview partner even stated that this was a historic effort. For the first time, all civil society came together to make sure that these interests would not be ignored. The reasons why interests are ignored has to do with the two other strategies that I'll mention shortly, but the common theme that was mentioned in many interviews is that for poor individuals in Germany, oftentimes nothing happens until the courts force the government to change their policies, and that this is a continuing theme within German social policy making, which is why a further strategy is emphasizing social rights. So advocating for human and social rights within the German welfare state, against the background that welfare associations consider themselves a voice of social work as a profession of human rights, by challenging power structures that undermine benefits, particularly emphasizing Articles 1 and 2 of the German Constitution of Basic Law, which, for instance, emphasize the dignity of individuals, of citizens living in Germany, and that these needs aren't being met through the welfare state. So welfare associations, and this is obviously always also the case during the pandemic, encourage, fund, and participate in lawsuits to establish further social rights, to call out the government for not living up to what they agreed to, but also to create further obligations between the welfare associations and the government to cooperate with the welfare associations. One example of this is a campaign by Paritätischer called Mensch, du hast Recht, Human, you have rights, or You're right, also a double entendre, to emphasize the centrality of social rights within the German welfare state. One topic in particular concerned social rights was the issue of school computers for children living in families receiving this benefit. Initially, children living in these families did not have access to schooling, which is their fundamental right, and school lunches because they were in lockdowns, for instance. And so welfare associations emphasize the need for their digital participation, not only in education, but also digital participation in total as a fundamental human right in terms of the social, cultural, minimal subsistence level. Looking at some of the interviews, it was oftentimes emphasized that benefits within the welfare system are not a form of charity. They are a form of fundamental human rights. and that this needs to be emphasized at every possible occasion. Important was also the perception among the welfare associations that legal rights are eroding and that these legal rights need to constantly be fought for. And connected to the third narrative strategy was the fact when beneficiaries tried to receive, for instance, the funding for school computers at job centers, they were oftentimes treated badly, portrayed as criminals, treated like monsters for trying to get something, receive a benefit that is legally theirs. And in the eyes of many in the welfare associations, this has to do with poverty being considered something that's an individual failure. In their eyes, many in the government don't view poverty as something having to do with structural issues, but rather this meritocratic tone that one deserves it because one made the wrong decisions in life. And this has to do with the distrust that exists within government, but also because of maltreatment from the welfare recipients towards the government. So a key task and something that they try to solve is to eliminate this distrust by establishing images of everyday experiences by people on welfare. You can see the moral tone of this kind of distrust during the Bürgergeld reform debates. This kind of perception, people receiving benefits, if we give them too much, then they won't work. They're somehow inherently lazy. These kind of perspectives play a significant role in policy processes. And because of this, welfare associations have a perception that the government often sees welfare levels as being enough to live a dignified life, and that there's no need to do anything more. There's enough there. There's also a lot of stereotyping and moralization of discourse concerning the poor and welfare recipients. As I mentioned during the Bürgergeld debates, how individuals receiving benefits were portrayed. So a key goal is to transmit different images. And one way to also do this, and this was a strategy mentioned in some interviews, was to take individuals affected by poverty, affected by homelessness, and other social ails with the welfare association representatives directly to meetings with people from the ministries, from the labor ministries, so they can see face to face what the reality is of people who are on these benefits. That's another strategy used to overcome the distrust. So some more quotes from the interviews. So one interview partner from the Welfare Association emphasized the moralization of the discourse that exists and that was anchored into the discourse during the Hartz IV reforms, 2003, 2005, and that these kind of distorted images of people receiving welfare benefits have remained both inside of the government as well as within the collective consciousness in Germany. One insight into this was the discussion about the sanctions being stopped during the pandemic and keeping that policy of no more sanctions within the system. One interview partner talked about how those within the government or some politicians perceived that the world was about to end if we got rid of the sanctions within the system. And this is because this system is supposed to have sanctions and penalizations so that it's so unattractive to prevent people from getting to this level. So in many ways, in their eyes, a deliberative move from those in power. So for the welfare associations to overcome this, it's important to let individuals speak for themselves during meetings with the ministries, as I mentioned, but also providing them a platform with campaigns like Unerhört, as I mentioned, and that this belongs to their democratic understanding, allowing those affected to speak their mind. This is the three narrative strategies summarized along the lines of the MPF model. I I can send you this if you'd like. I'll go to the conclusions directly. So the pandemic was an opportunity for welfare associations to prove their relevance as civil society actors, as a voice for social work, but also as a representation of weak interests, to lobby for welfare changes, to expand redistributive measures. And they did this by constantly shifting focus from individual blame to structural issues underlying poverty and social exclusion. And because these are fundamental rights to live a dignified life, emphasizing the deservingness of those individuals to have enough funds to lead their lives. Nonetheless, there are deeply ingrained prejudices that hinder the ability for the welfare associations to secure further social rights and to change laws as they would see fit. And also in the media discourse, I didn't get into much detail about this, there's also significant pushback against some perceptions or some interpretations of the state of poverty in Germany. For instance, against the portrayals by the Paritätische Welfare Association, who are portrayed as hysteric in discourse. So despite playing this significant role in public discourse, despite being a significant part both of the welfare system and social work, welfare associations have significant challenges in realizing their goals. Yes, they're involved in discourse. Yes, they can even influence what's put on the agenda and discussed. But ultimately, as we saw with the Bürgergeld reform, they have serious challenges in achieving their goals as they would see fit. So more research needs to be done, in my eyes, in the interaction between opposing actors, how the welfare associations are perceived in policymaking, to further understand this difficulty of the welfare associations. Okay.